The year is 1928. Studebaker was going to offer an all-new inline 8 to compete with all of the other brands that offered 8-line 8s. Companies such as Packard, Hupmobile, Buick, Chrysler, Pontiac, Pierce Arrow, just to name a few. Studebaker also purchased Pierce Arrow in 1928 to try to tap into the luxury car market. They would own Pierce Arrow up until 1933, so the reason Studebaker went to a straight 8 engine now becomes more apparent. Studebaker would make a straight 8 version for the president, commander, and dictator. So, that's how this episode is going to be broken down to try to mitigate confusion. Albert Russell Erskine, who was president of Studebaker, wanted the Studebaker president to be the finest automobile on the American road. Erskine wanted the new Studebaker president to be powered by a straight 8 engine with Studebaker's name on it. It's worth pointing out, this was the first and only era Studebaker made a straight 8. They would make a V8, but that wouldn't come until way later in 1951. Erskine was met with opposition, difference in opinions from his chief engineer stating the 6 is a good, durable, reliable engine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. He was fired and replaced by Barney Roos, who was no stranger to designing straight 8s. He worked for both Marmon and Pierce Arrow. Studebaker's straight 8 design was a relatively straightforward design. L-head, meaning the valves and the pistons take up roughly the same space in the block. Instead of the valves being overhead inside the head, they are inside the block. 2 valves per cylinder alternating between intake and exhaust. With detachable cylinder head, the crankshaft is heavy drop forged steel and statically and dramatically balanced. 5 large main bearings, bronze backed, Babbitt facing. The camshaft is driven by silence composition gear. Valves are angled ever so slightly to bring the head closer to the cylinder bore for a compact combustion chamber. Fully pressurized oiling lubrication system to the main bearings, connecting rod, and camshaft bearings. Introduced in 1928 for this Studebaker president, which goes back to 1926 and was powered by Studebaker's Big 6 before being replaced by this straight 8. It's worth pointing out that the Big 6 had a displacement of 354 cubic inch displacements. The all-new straight 8 that would replace it had 2 more cylinders with a smaller 312.5 cubic inch displacement. Flathead inline 8, 5.1 liters. It was good for 100 horsepower, 2,600 RPM, estimated 202 pound-feet, or 273 newton meters at around 1,400 RPM, with a bore of 3.375 inches and a stroke of 4.4 inches. Compression was 4.7 to 1, 5 main bearings. The years this engine was used was only for 1928, because later on that year, Studebaker would bore the 312.5 cubic inch displacement straight 8 to 337 cubic inch displacement flathead inline 8, 5.5 liters. It's good for anywhere between 109 to 115 horsepower, 3,200 RPM, an estimated 200 pound-feet or 271 newton meters at around 2,400 RPM, with a bore of 3.5 inches and a stroke of 3.3 inches. The years this engine was used was between 1928 through 1933. It's important to note that in 1930, compression was increased, bumping horsepower up to 115 horsepower. Studebaker would make 114 speed records, with 35 standing for 35 years. Studebaker had famous race car driver Abe Jenkins racing for them. At one of the endurance races, Studebaker, equipped with a 312.5, ran at an average speed of 68 miles per hour for 16 days continuously, clocked 30,000 miles flawlessly without any mechanical problems. Between the years of And this is very conflicting information. Some sources said 1930, other sources said between the years of 1931 through 1932. So between the years of 1930 through 1932, the engine was completely redesigned with 9 main bearings, carburetor, silencer, as well as improved manifold design, vibration dampener, aluminum pistons. But it was the same displacement, 337 cubic inch displacement, flathead inline 8, 5.5 liters. It's good for 122 horsepower, 3,200 RPM, an estimated 210 pound-feet, or 284 newton meters around 1600 RPM, with a bore of 3.5 inches and a stroke of 3.3 inches. Compression was 5.10 to 1, 9 main bearings, solid valve lifters. Years this engine was used, 1931 through 1933. Commander would get their very own straight 8 in 1929 and was smaller in displacement, 250.4 cubic inch displacement, inline 8, 4.1 liters. It's good for anywhere between 80 to 117 horsepower, between the RPM range of 2,800 to 4,000 RPM. Up to 177 pound-feet or 240 newton meters around 2,400 RPM. Bore of 3.1 inches and a stroke of 4.25 inches. Compression is anywhere between 6.3 all the way up to 8.5 to 1. 9 main bearing crankshaft. The years this engine was used was between 1929 through 1942. It was used in the Commander from 1929 through 1935, 1934 through 1942 for the President. Which, if you're listening, is a bit of contradicting information. Commander also got a different engine in 1933, 1 year only engine, 236 cubic inch displacement, flathead inline 8, 3.87 liters. It's good for 100 horsepower, around 3,200 RPM, estimated 202 pound-feet or 273 newton meters, around 1,800 RPM, with a bore of 3.17 inches and a stroke of 4 inches. The year that this was only used was 1933 for the Commander line of cars. In 1934, the Commander would use the smaller 221 cubic inch displacement engine that would be introduced in 1930. The Dictator got their own straight 8, which was patterned after the Commander 8, but with a longer stroke. Also roughly the same displacement as the engine it replaced, the 221.4 cubic inch displacement 6. And this made 2 more horsepower than the 6. 221 cubic inch displacement, inline, straight 8, 3.6 liters. It's good for anywhere between 70 to 85 horsepower, 3,200 RPM, estimated 150 pound-feet or 203 newton meters at 1,800 RPM, with a bore of 3.1 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. The years this engine was used was between 1930 through 1932 in the Dictator. 1933, there wasn't a Dictator model, so the engine became available in the Commander for 1934. In 1932, Studebaker lost a ton of money to the tune of $46 million, which sounds as bad as it does. $46 million, wow. So they had to make some cuts somewhere. So for 1933, Dictator was taken off the menu. For 1934, Studebaker would redesign all of its lines while teetering on going into receivership, which they kind of sort of did go to receivership. Studebaker would get rid or remarket the 6 by bringing back the Dictator, giving it a 6 and discontinuing the Rockney. Studebaker was forced into receivership and had to sell Pierce Arrow in 1933, which they sold to a group of Buffalo investors for $1 million. But Pierce Arrow could never right the sinking ship, and they were gone by 1938. Studebaker was in receivership until March 9th of 1935. Commander would be dropped after 1935, and they would come back in 1938 as a replacement for the Dictator as the Commander 6. The straight 8 would soldier on until 1942, but after the war, Studebaker would retire the straight 8 altogether, going back to just offering flathead 6s. But in the background, they would be working on their very own overhead valve V8 design. but it would not appear until 1951. But as they say, that is an engine episode for another day, or you could watch it right after this one if you wish. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. Two scenarios today. In the first scenario, would you rather have a 1928 Studebaker president or 1930 Studebaker dictator or 1934 Studebaker commander? I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario, 1932 Studebaker president or 1935 Studebaker president or 1939 Studebaker president. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I liked putting this one together. Can you guys think of any other engine episodes that you'd love to see in the future? I was thinking about maybe branching off and doing some motorcycle engines. What do you guys think about that? Like Harley, Indian, Bruff Superior, Triumph, BSA, Honda. Talk about all of the different engines. Maybe do a single engine family episode for Indian and Harley Davidson. Talk about all the different V-twins and give each specific engine a specific episode. Looking for feedback in the comment section, what you guys think. Until next time, toodaloo!